The increase in cost of living is having a direct impact on how our businesses function, how they recruit and retain talent. And with population projections that put our total population at nearly 1 million by 2045, now is the time to think about how our day-to-day lives function when our population nearly doubles over the next 20 years. We've got to think about this and bring a sense of urgency to it. For those of you who aren't aware, today's webinar is kind of an add-on to our Future Is Now speaker series that we've been hosting this year. Harriet was originally scheduled to visit us here in Northwest Arkansas for our June 21st event, where we discussed the importance of community engagement. But she fell victim to many flight delays and challenges in getting here, but has been kind enough to offer her time to spend with us today. We know that Harriet's perspective as a planner for Washington, D.C., her work at HUD, her experience leading planning at the state level, and her current role as the executive director of New Urban Mobility Alliance will be valuable, and appreciate her joining us today. Finally, today's session really is meant to be a conversation. Again, thank you for those of you who submitted questions ahead of time. It was billed as a Ask Me Anything, so I hope you brought some questions. And with that, Harriet, I'll turn it over to you for a brief introduction, and we'll take some questions from there. Thank you all for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Duke and Isabel. I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you, and I do appreciate the really great questions that people have already submitted. So I think we'll have a good conversation. I don't want to come to you under false pretenses. Everything that Duke told you about where I've worked is absolutely true. But I actually studied civil engineering in school, and I am the most accidental planner that you'll ever meet. I probably haven't had the career path that a lot of you have had, working your way through planning school and planning offices and maybe in different places. Most of my career has been spent in the public sector, and what happened to me is I was working at the Environmental Protection Agency. I actually worked on the Vertex site in Jacksonville. But my work at EPA, I worked in different regional offices, Region 6, which is where Arkansas is part of that EPA regional office, that federal region, Region 9 in California. And then I came to headquarters, and I got assigned to some random meeting when I was in the policy office to go to something called the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And I had been doing enforcement at EPA, so I considered myself sort of a badass, and I was really about making polluters pay. And I'd never sat across the table from a private sector entity except in an adversarial role. And so it was really kind of game changing for me to be part of this President's Council effort and to talk about community sustainability and be sitting down with private sector interests, where I was surprised to see that we agreed like 80% of the time on what communities might need, to grow sustainably, to exist sustainably, what their residents might need. And that as we work together, the 80% grew to 90% or 95%. And it was a really different way of doing business. And for me, it was also a way of addressing an environmental problem, which was kind of the uncontrolled sprawl that was our predominant development pattern, that was overtaking the gains that EPA had made on air quality and on water quality. So for me, it was an epiphany. It was one of those moments that, I can do a lot more, and it would be so much more interesting to work on these issues from a different place. And so shockingly, at EPA, they let me create a new office that focused on development, that focused on the built environment within the policy office. And also shockingly, that office exists today. It's had 3 different names, but It's still there and still doing its work. And it kind of launched me off on a very different path that eventually led me to being the Secretary of Planning for the state of Maryland, and the planning director in DC for the last 2 mayors, as well as running community planning and development at HUD. So it was a happy accident. But ever since that time at EPA, where we basically started a national smart growth movement, that has been my North Star. That's the thing I want to work on. And there are literally tens of thousands of jobs you could hold and be working on this, from water quality or transportation or housing or disaster resilience or community equity. There are so many places where you can be doing this work, and my jobs kind of suggest that I've thought, oh, it'd be great to try all of those tens of thousands of different things and gain those perspectives. So in almost every job I've had, I really have kind of a newbie's perspective to it. I don't know how to do that job necessarily. I don't know how others have done it. I look at it like, well, what's the thing that I could help to do? What's the opportunity that there might be to move the needle on these issues? In DC, it was rewriting the zoning code for the first time in 50 years. It was, doing the first climate plan and sustainability plan and resilience plan. It was really trying to focus on places that had transit in our city, but where there wasn't very much development near that transit. So fewer people were having access to what's a relatively scarce resource. So I'm only to say that, my credentials aren't that I'm a great planner, but that I have an open mind, and that I am always looking for the opportunity to make communities better. And sometimes that opportunity is in unexpected places. And that planning is the greatest job in the world. It's the greatest thing to be doing. Each of you as planners, you are futurists. You're in charge of the future wherever you're working. And that's a wonderful position to be in. Often no one else is looking out, over the horizon like you have to do, and that you're in it for the long game. A lot of the things that you are going to plan are going to be implemented, after the people who opposed you the most are gone, right? Or even I shouldn't put it that way, after your supporters might be gone, that's when things might be fully implemented that you're doing. And that plans are not self-implementing, right? I mean, some of you might actually have capital budget control as well as planning. If so, I really envy you. I have never had that. So I've always thought about plans as being the planning process itself is the way to build allies and gain allies and align goals and values with a very broad group of folks who I'm going to need to get these plans implemented. And I want to start that implementation the second the ink is dry on the plan. So that plan gets momentum. It builds legitimacy. And people say, oh, it's being implemented. Okay, let's pay attention. Let's see what else we can do. What else is in there that needs to happen? So anyway, I'll stop and turn it back to Duke to take us through our conversation today.
Well, I appreciate all of that. My 9-year-old daughter, I think, would summarize your career path as a beautiful oops. If she colors,
yeah,
she colors outside the lines, or makes a mistake. It's like, well, it's okay. We'll just make the best of it. So while folks, think about questions, again, use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question. I'll go ahead and get us started here, and kind of pair a question that was submitted ahead of time with a question that Isabel put together. And what role do you see planners playing, as they confront some of their city's biggest challenges and the challenges that are, common among our cities and municipalities these days? Where is the place for planners to insert and play a role in that?
So I really think of planners as leaders, right? Not in competition with the mayor or the city manager, but that you have the data and the information to know where the community has been, where your city has been, and to be able to project where it's going. When I called you, you're all futurists, right? And the planning director is the futurist in chief. And almost nobody is got that job. So, one of the wonderful things about not knowing anything about how to do be the planning director of a city, is that I didn't think there was anything that wasn't my responsibility. I thought planning had a lot to do with public safety. It had a lot to do with affordability. It had a lot to do with access to jobs. It had a lot to do with retail success. There wasn't anything I didn't think wasn't my job. So that it turns out some people were surprised by that, but and maybe some people were even resistant to it, right? I wanted my performance metrics to be things like mode split, and I wanted it to be things like income growth and population growth. And this is coming, when I was planning director, we had 5 state decades of population decline, no growth. But I wanted to make population growth one of my metrics, and the council told me, my oversight chair said, those can't be your metrics. You are not, you don't control those things. I'm like, what use is a planning department if you have no influence on any of those things that are important to the city? Planning is about these things. So they eventually gave in, right? But so I guess what I would say is that, your job is to say, this is what's changing, because people can be swimming in the tide of change and not be aware. And even though there might be more walking and more biking and more, more commerce by, by internet, if the people you're talking to aren't actually doing it themselves, they don't see any change. They don't see anything different. But your obligation, is to help people see the tide of change that they're swimming in and get people prepared for what's coming and talk about it all the time. You have the data, you have the information, and that's the context for every time you open your mouth, you're providing that context, and that makes people trust you and also find what you're saying interesting, because they may not otherwise know this, right? About things that are happening. So I would say, don't let anyone put you in a box. You're responsible for the future of the places that you plan, and that's everything.
That's great. Thank you for that. To implement much of this, the planners need to garner the support of their elected leaders. They need to garner the support of the public at large. Do you have any kind of tips of the trade to help garner that support and build that support so these plans can eventually be implemented?
So, yes, I would say that is true. I would say that that part of the reason we're doing this the way we're doing it is that my experience as a planner got me to love Q&A as a format, and I got a lot of opposition to everything I wanted to do, right? But for me, the answer, the solution wasn't to just find allies and only talk to them, but to talk to the people who didn't agree, right? And to basically, what was helpful to me, I didn't do this, but I inherited a comprehensive plan, right? I did updates to the plan, but I inherited a comprehensive plan where the ink was dry. I started my job 2 weeks later. I was actually saying I may not start it if it didn't get passed by the council, but it got passed, and it was the result of a comprehensive engagement process with citizens in every neighborhood, and it was based on a vision plan that the previous mayor had put together, because DC was in such a bad state that there hadn't been any real planning for a long time. And so to restart the planning office, to restart the planning practice in DC, they got people together to talk not about plans, but about their aspirations. What was the kind of city that they wanted DC to be? What are the things about it that they value now, that they want to preserve, that's important? And what are the things that they want to happen in the future? And that vision plan, could be distilled into a few words, and a set of values. But it was, in a sentence, it was about DC growing as an inclusive city, right? So, whether or not every person you end up talking to about any issue like bike lanes or affordable housing or zoning changes, I always found it useful to go back. These are our values. We have said collectively that we want to be an inclusive city. So if we want to be an inclusive city, that means implicitly, right, that we want that inclusion to be across the city, not just in a few neighborhoods. So I have some suggestions about how we can be more inclusive, because every plan is in a neighborhood, right? And the opposition's in the neighborhood that you're talking about where that plan is. And I would just ask people, so what are your ideas about how we become more inclusive? You don't have to do the thing I'm thinking about, but tell me how we achieve this thing. Because, it's not really fair to let one neighborhood opt out of this notion and count on other places to take up the burden of inclusion or the privilege or the opportunity of inclusion. Like, we're going to do this all together. It might look different in different parts of the city. Of course, there are different features, different transportation options, different development patterns, but we're all going to do our part to implement this ideal, right? So what are your ideas about how to do this? So I think that's part of it. You also say, look, this is how things are changing. I mean, Northwest Arkansas has more than doubled in population in 30 years, right? So it's safe to say it's projected to grow at a similar pace going forward. So we know growth has to be accommodated, right? And with growth might come a lot more traffic. It might come with a lot, higher prices, a lot less affordability, a lot of displacement. So we know this. What can we do to make it different? I have some ideas. There are ideas from other places, but what would you do to make it different, right? What would you do to address this? Because not addressing it is also a choice. And we know what's going to happen. Because the other thing about being a planner, about being the futurist in chief, is that you have fellow futurists all around the country. You can, or other countries for that matter, you can have a ghost of Christmas future. I always picked on San Francisco because we were similar size, but I'd point to them and say, oh no, you don't want the prices that San Francisco has. And I'm sure we're the ghost of Christmas future for other cities in DC, but you get my drift, that you have access to peers and examples, and you can even drag people to your meetings. You can get people to write a letter. That was so effective. When I wanted to get rid of parking minimums downtown, to have another planning director say, we did it, this was the impact, it was great. It ended up being great. So, use all of those things, because my favorite author, William Gibson, has this great quote that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So the future that you're looking at, someone else has already experienced. So let's get that information and share it so that we can be prepared.
That's great. I love that quote. I'm going to make note of that. You mentioned that. What are some other regions or municipalities or cities that Northwest Arkansas should be aware of or dedicate a little more study to, as best practices as it pertains to growth or housing or transportation and mobility?
So, I could point to other places, but I will say you are in a particular and special category. Not every place is growing. Growth gives you opportunities that shrinking places or stagnant places do not have. So, like, rejoice, therefore, right? So it's creating problems for you, but you'd have different and harder to solve problems if you didn't have growth. Okay, so things are going to happen because of growth. You're going to build new streets. You're going to do some retrofitting of other places. You're going to have, hopefully additional revenues. So I think the thing is the new infrastructure contains everything you'd want it to have, and maybe even make that an ordinance, like the city of Cambridge and other places, that every street's a complete street. Why retrofit with bike lanes if you could put them in from the beginning, or mixed, let's call them slow lanes, right? Which is not higher speed, heavy vehicles, but gradations of slower speed vehicles, pedestrians, scooters, bikes. I would say that, I've mentioned this to Duke before, that, our primary fallacy in the US is that we have built our cities and our economy on the assumption that everybody owns and operates an automobile, right? I mean, another way to think about this is that we have agreed to assess a private transportation tax on every household. That is very expensive. Our transportation costs relative to our counterparts in European cities, where there might be excise taxes on automobiles and costs of fuel that are much, much greater, like 100% of the cost of a car for an excise tax, and much more expensive fuel. And yet those residents have lower transportation costs because they have lower levels of car ownership, because they don't need a car for every driver, and some households don't have them at all, right? So one of the things that I think is a hard thing to do, but a really important thing to do, is to question the assumption of mandatory automobility. Northwest Arkansas is blessed with these cities that are, formed around town squares, Main Street communities, very traditional, very mixed use, very walkable. The newer development, isn't looking like this, but you have in your DNA examples of what it could be. And that, places, a lot of big cities are seeing modern, current examples of the perils of single-use zoning. These office-only enclaves are really, really suffering. And even in the same city, the places that have mixed development, a lot of housing along with office, along with retail, maybe even some small manufacturing, those places are doing pretty well. But the places that are single use, it's just not very adaptable or flexible. No one anticipated either a global pandemic or the change in work that accompanied it, but the lack of ability to adapt has been really difficult for folks. So part of thinking about this, and I ended up doing this with our zoning, I made a lot of the zoning for new places that got zoned for any commercial. I didn't dictate the mix. I might have had a minimum or a maximum, but I basically let it be somewhat market driven, so that there'd always be some residential with the commercial. But I think if I was doing it now, I might try to help design a model building code, or a model of a flexible building that could much more easily, even floor by floor, move from residential to commercial office, so that you wouldn't have these huge costs that people are looking at to try to do that conversion. And then you could be more market flexible. But I think that, it's a hard thing to try to retrofit city streets. People really feel entitled to what they have. and to take it away, you know, is a hard thing to do. People feel aggrieved, you know, even if it means that a lot of people could not be in their cars at all because they have other ways to get around. Even if it could mean that the companies that are really hurting for workforce could get workers to work a lot more inexpensively and easier, and that maybe even attract a workforce that has difficulty owning and maintaining an automobile, right? So I would just say that for some of these things, you know, there are examples for you kind of in every city, and I wouldn't presume, you know, to tell you do this or do that. I would just say that, you know, there's an opportunity for you to move the needle every day in different parts of the cities that you're in, and that part of it is preparing people for what's happening, whether it's changing climate, whether it's a growing population, whether it's the pressure on affordability that suggests that yes, housing is part of that answer, but cheaper transportation is another part of that answer. So in our region, and this is similar to a national statistic, transportation is 19% of household income, right? On average, the housing cost is between 20 and 30% of household income. Okay, so the two together are half of a paycheck. If you're if you're in the average, if you're low income, both of those numbers are higher for you. And sometimes transportation is actually higher than the housing cost. In DC, our residents spend 9% of household income on transportation, not 19%, right? Yeah. So is that a competitive advantage? Oh, yeah, it totally is. And it makes our households resilient. You know, when there's a recession, cars drop off our DMV rolls, you know, not because people are fleeing the jurisdiction, but because they can dial down their transportation costs and weather a recession. So in 2008, when the housing crisis happened, there was almost no foreclosure or bankruptcy in DC because people could modulate their transportation costs and still pay their mortgage, right? And in the region, which is the same jobs and housing market, it was terrible, you know, in the outer jurisdictions where people had 2 or 3 cars per household, right? And they had no choice. They couldn't get to their jobs without those cars. So I would just say that, you know, it's a part of the strategy to have these options. And again, it's an option. People may not exercise them, but a lot of people would find it a relief to have one less car, right? Not have to have that mortgage. I'm sorry, not have to have that car payment, and be able to put it in as an investment into retirement, into a house that they can own, into education, right? So give people that flexibility. It's really just a choice. And a lot of people, if you make it safe and convenient, will do it because honestly, it's also much more predictable. It's much faster. I mean, I now have an e-bike. Oh my God, I love that thing. So heat, weather, topography, distance, not an issue. And I can pretty much beat anybody to any destination by car or metro because, you know, at least in my city, distances are pretty short and there's pretty much traffic. So I'm not in traffic for the most part. And yeah, so it's great. And that, like I say, you can say to people, if you don't want to do it, it doesn't have to be for you, but it might take other drivers off the road. And you'll probably really like that.
No, that's really good perspective. I haven't quite gone down the e-bike road yet, but I need to, definitely. I see a question here. Keaton, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Harriet, thanks for joining us in Northwest Arkansas this morning. You mentioned the importance of metrics and the importance of quantifying the combined cost of housing and transportation. Do you have thoughts on how a region like Northwest Arkansas might set metrics for success that incorporate the combined costs of housing and transportation, either from a planning and approval perspective or a or development incentive perspective, or how do we leverage the power of that H+T methodology to incentivize our development patterns and increase the visibility of that important metric?
I mean, first of all, it's to use it and to talk about it, and then to compare yourself with other places. Sometimes naturally, the differences are most stark, in places that have lots of transit, like Chicago, that have, older cities that have a gridded street network. So there's a lot of different routes to a given place, as opposed to a more modern development, US development pattern where there are arterials, and cul-de-sacs, and that there are not a lot of routes to a place. There's one route or maybe two routes. But the places that have gridded street networks and things like that, and transit, they have, they also often have corner stores. And so places that some daily needs can be met more easily without necessarily having to get into a car. So I would start to look at those statistics. Like, you can use the Center for Neighborhood Technologies location efficiency housing and transportation index to compare places of any size, and just kind of see where things shake out, and maybe begin to analyze why there are differences even in Northwest Arkansas, or even in places that might be similar. But I do think that to define housing affordability, is to neglect overall affordability. So I do think it's up to you to make it a thing and to talk about it. I funded that H&T research, from my time at EPA, and I used it in every job I've had ever since because it was really useful. And honestly, some people have never heard or never realized this private transportation tax that we pay, that we just accept it, that we have to pay for a car, and that we have to have it to live our lives, when it's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily great. And the places where you do have to have a car, but you have these other features, a mix of uses, short trips, short distances, to those destinations, and some amount of transportation choice. Even if everybody still has a car, they keep the car longer. The mileage is lower. The costs for transportation are still lower, right? So, you can begin to make an inroad on this without necessarily, having a war on cars. What you want are choices for people.
Mm-hmm.
And people want to live differently. They want to have different options. They want to be active. They want to, have a lower carbon possibilities. They want to be resilient as a household and as a city. So, there are all these arguments. And that's the other thing about planning, and about having a set of values that you might share in your community, that for different audiences, the argument is different. You've got some really big companies who have workforce issues, right?
Yeah.
Their ability to attract and retain. Transportation is huge for them. They may not even know it, but it is huge for them. And maybe the thing is to have some pilots with some of those employers, where they might provide e-bike incentives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they might do other things to help people get to work more easily. That could be part of a signing bonus for a new employee, or it could be a fleet of vehicles that are lent to them, or whatever it might be, that they can be your ally. Once you know what they want, it's not that hard to find an initiative that could make them an ally for some of the things that you're trying to do.
You mentioned the word options and optionality, and to focus that on housing just a little bit. What are some of the best practices that municipalities could implement to assist builders or encourage builders and developers, excuse me, to create more housing, create workforce housing. And do you think that we're reaching a point? I know other states have started to take some action. Do you think the state level is an area that we as a region should start focusing some of our attention for success to catalyze that development?
I think you will find that the states that are doing something on this also have a state level planning apparatus. So not all states, not the majority of states have that. I don't know if Arkansas has that. I'd be surprised if Arkansas had it, but in some cases, the organization that you lead, so philanthropy has supported, and this was a question that I got in advance too, about what can philanthropy do. So the Louisiana Foundation has supported for years an organization called the Center for Planning Excellence, who even the state kind of regards as their de facto state planning agency. And they both give them money to do planning activities, but they're not always aligned, right? What the state might want to do and what CPEX is trying to do. But the ability to have an organization in the state that can help provide capacity to smaller communities that might be facing growth but may not have the planning expertise to be able to do model ordinances, to be able to create cohorts within the state of communities that might be facing similar issues. I mean, all those things are super valuable. And I think the states that are taking matters into their own hands are doing so with a state planning entity of some kind, so that not everything is stick. There's also some carrot. When I was the Secretary of Planning in Maryland, we used the capital budget as the stick, that you could grow however you wanted, but if you wanted state money for roads or for other infrastructure, then you had to follow a growth plan. You got to decide where your next 20 years of growth would go, but once you mapped it, and it couldn't go beyond a 20-year projection, once you mapped it, you couldn't start, just putting infrastructure money anywhere you wanted to in your, in your local government jurisdiction if it was outside that area you designated for growth. Of course, you could also change that designation, but you couldn't just scatter it, right, across the entire county or city. You had to be targeted, and you had to be trying to create more of this convenience and create more mixed use. So having, we detailed planners for a year or more at a time to different counties and municipalities to help them with these plans. And the willingness, I mean, these were legislative initiatives, in California, I think also in Minnesota. So, your state better than I about whether that's likely to happen. But the other things about helping places do a better job in the face of growth, that can go a long way without, those kind of mandates, which I have to say, I'm a big fan of local control. Like, even how we did it in Maryland still left the decisions to the locals. It just said, once you've made your decision, you have to kind of stick to it, right? So you decide where growth is going to go, and you can get state infrastructure money for that, but not to other places. So I think that in many cases, the state actions are either out of desperation in California, or out of maybe high-mindedness, right? That single-family zoning that has racist origins in a lot of places has nevertheless produced neighborhoods where, affluent voters live, and where it's hard to sometimes get change at the local level. What we found in making changes to our zoning, that accessory dwelling units was kind of widely appealing, even in those single family zones, because everybody has, can imagine a situation where elderly parents, where returning college students, where au pairs, or where relatives who need a place to stay, could be. So they could see how, that could be useful. And that's the kind of change that can double the density over time in a single family zone without changing how the neighborhood looks at all. So, those are ways to start.
Yeah, incremental. And, I think that aligns with, some of our thoughts in our messaging. And as we're telling the story of housing affordability, recent college grads can no longer live in the communities they grew up in, they can't afford to live there. Going back to your days in planning, and before I mention this, I really would welcome any questions from our attendees. Just raise your hand and jump in here. And just to kind of lighten it up a little bit, what is a project that you took on that you're really proud of, that was something that you just thought was impossible, that you got over the finish line? Maybe it was an off the wall proposal or idea. Just what's something like that from your past time as a planner that you could share with the group?
I mean, I have a lot of those kinds of examples. You got to hear a little bit about it, about one thing, which was the 11th Street Bridge Park. I got to the point in DC that I started to believe in magical thinking, that if I said 3 times out loud at public meetings that X, Y, or Z should happen, by the 3rd time somebody would step up to create the company, to try the practice, to quit their job and go start a nonprofit to build this park or whatever it was. So, I definitely enjoyed at least the feeling, the fiction, the illusion that by putting some creative ideas out in the world, that some people would act on them, right? And that would be something. So I was despairing of how much vacancy we had in DC, in retail spaces. I wanted active ground floors, and we had so many businesses that had time of day uses, so that even once you were successfully getting retail or a restaurant in a place, that it might not be used, in the middle of the day. And especially now, but this was true to some degree before, people were working from home. There were, people had small businesses that, in every residential neighborhood, there was an office buildings where the people that were there during the day who would have used a retail outlet like a coffee shop or whatever if it was open, right? So getting people to share those uses, getting people to be temporarily in vacant space so that it was activated. I even did a project called the Lobby Project. I hated office lobbies that were so sterile and so huge. And sometimes they were an entire city block, just with some, fancy empty furniture and nothing happening. So I got a few building owners, strangely, not the ones with vacancies, actually, the ones that were leased up, to started programming with art, with activity, with food service, stuff that people could bring in on a cart, baked goods and coffee. And it was a wildly successful amenity. People loved it. So just, planning is such a creative endeavor, and it's a fun thing to do with your residents, like they might have creative ideas about what could happen. I got, toward I did this job for almost 2 full terms, but toward the end, I was like, oh, what would be really helpful is if I had a little money that I saved for the planning budget to give to the community to begin to implement the plans. Like, it doesn't have to be a lot. It could be just a few $1,000s. So maybe they'd be doing beautification projects, so it would buy some plants. Maybe it would buy paint. Maybe you're painting a street tattoo or holding a festival, to celebrate the end of the plan, and on a commercial, little commercial strip, having a street party. So maybe other people will be able to come and see this neighborhood and see what it has to offer. But that momentum of getting the plan implemented, and also putting some of that control in the hands of the residents, so their ideas they can help bring to life, right? And flesh out. I actually am on the board of an organization now that sort of does that as its mission, an organization called IOBI, In Our Backyards, a crowdfunding platform for neighborhood projects, but also a leadership development program for neighborhood leaders. So, I think those are, the great thing about being a planner is that you can have this multitude of objectives and be able to work on all of them, through your plans. So, I think that's just super cool.
You
I
mentioned,
will say, like,
oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you mentioned creativity, and one of the questions that came in ahead of time was how do you stay creative as a public servant? Do you could get kind of caught up in the day-to-day, how do you keep that creative juices alive?
So you'll be shocked to hear this, but government is risk averse, right? So if you want to be creative or take risks, you think, oh, government is not the place for me. But that would be wrong. Okay? Because government is averse to risk, but there's a lot you can do to de-risk things. There's a lot you can do to manage expectations about how a project might go, including, grabbing what someone else might call failure and you calling it the process. So for example, we put bike lanes down the center of Pennsylvania Avenue. You might have heard of it. It's the street in Washington that runs between the Capitol and the White House. They have things like inaugural parades and all kinds of things on that street. So it's kind of an important street, and it's got Am I frozen for you? Did you hear all of that?
We missed just after you underscored the importance of Pennsylvania Avenue.
Just that there are lots of organizations that have jurisdiction, so it's not even just getting approval from the city to do it. There's a federal planning commission, there's a fine arts commission. So like years is what it could take to get approval to put in a bike lane there. So because we had a not paying a lot of attention mayor, and he was focused on education, and a risk-taking transportation director, we were able to say, we're gonna put in temporary bike lanes. So it's not the permanent thing. So don't get yourself all lathered up. It's just temporary. And rather than study it for years, we're gonna learn by doing. So we expect to change the configuration, and then once we get to something that looks good and we try it for a while, we'll come back and make it permanent. So we moved these bike lanes, and at first they were really wide and took a lot of traffic lanes away, and the drivers screamed. We made it narrow and maybe kind of on one side. The bicyclists hated it. Basically, when the screaming got down to a dull roar, I think we changed it 6 times, okay, which would have been a failure in government, right, by any measure. But no, we said that this is our process.
Just
we're going to take this feedback from users, right? And so that was probably in 2010. So let's see, that's a dozen years ago. That's where they are. They're still there. We never got around to getting permanent approval, but they're so beloved, no one would move them now, right? So So you can do that. You have to
Yeah.
see, like, you have to de-risk it for you, the people you work for, right? They don't want to get angry calls, but you can also say, this is a way that we can get the input, but not have this really long, super involved process. Temporary is a magic word. So it gives you the ability to try things and to be creative. And then you think about the objections people might have and you try to preempt them. So it's just, it's some of you do this naturally and do it all the time without thinking, but you know, it can easily be part of your job to do these creative things, period. Because, you know, you have constituents who would love to do something like this. This doesn't have to be everybody, but you don't have to involve everybody. You know, you can try some things and take the steps to lower the risk of being creative.
That's great.
And that sometimes means partners, like having the Northwest Arkansas Council be a sponsor, or the ULI be a sponsor, or one of the employers be a sponsor. Whoa, that hugely de-risks it for you. So think about that too.
I love the trial balloon approach. Looks like we have a question. I'm guessing this is Jeff Cooperstein. Jeff, is that you?
Yeah, it's me.
Your name on the screen doesn't immediately tell me who it is, but go ahead.
So a few years ago, I was talking with a developer, and he talked to me a little bit about this idea of nodes as developments rather than all, development or all, mixed uses, and just trying to densify your core. He mentioned this idea about you can have nodes that kind of provide more place, because he talked about, place is important. So, everything doesn't have to be in downtown Fayetteville, downtown Springdale, downtown Fayetteville. What about having a node in Lincoln? What about, Siloam? What are your thoughts about that? And how would you tie that to housing and transportation?
So I think nodes are really important. You're already a polycentric region. Those 4 cities are nodes in a sense. You're a regional housing and jobs market, and people live in different places, but might commute to others, or, one spouse might go one place, another place. But I like the idea of those nodes as how you develop or redevelop, but a particularly new development, how you do that. So, you're not gonna change the practice of every home builder and developer necessarily, but if you can encourage and maybe even make it easier for places that are doing mixed use development, kind of town-centered development, right, where there are transportation choices and some daily destinations. Maybe the anchor is a library, right? Maybe the anchor is is a medical facility outlet. That it can be different things that cause people to make trips to that place, but then build other things around it that have a synergy. And these nodes, I think, can also be a little denser. That doesn't mean it's a 10-story or 20-story building, but maybe it's a 4-story or a 6-story building, right? In places that are land constrained, we are now more and more making our public land places that we're doing development on top. I mean, I made grocery stores have apartments on top. Not because they had to, but because I suggested I might not approve a rezoning if they didn't do that. We're landlocked in D.C.
Right.
And they're like, well, we're not residential developers. I'm like, that's what partnerships are for, right? I'm like, think of them as like dedicated customers. Everyone in that building is going to shop at your store, and you haven't removed the ability for anybody else to get to it. So how is it bad for you, right? And someone's going to pay you for the privilege of doing that development. So anyway, it didn't take a lot of convincing, but I think the idea that you would grow in this nodal way is a perfectly good idea. I don't know how else you would start, to get a different development pattern if you couldn't create some examples of it. with new development. But that means really trying to find the developers who are willing to do it, and then raising the visibility of what they've done. As planners, you're long term, so you have to ask yourself, what's the first sign that this is a better thing? Like, how would I know? You know, so I used to have arguments all the time about parking, right? And like, I always wanted much less parking than the developers wanted. And the developers were usually coming from outside the city, and they didn't even know the household rate of car ownership where they were trying to develop. And so I would say, you know, do you think you're going to double the rate of car ownership in your development? And they'd be like, well, you know, they didn't know that, you know, like they'd say, well, no. I'm like, well, then why are you parking at you know, at 1.5, you know, spaces per unit? You know, the car ownership rate is like 40% of households where you are. So sometimes I would have to say, in a big project, we're going to have an experiment. I'm going to give you the parking that you want, and in your next phase, you're going to eat that parking for the next part. You know, if you build it and it doesn't get used, which I guarantee you it won't. So in any event, that's, for me, that was the first sign whether this was right or not, right? So now you ask them to measure parking utilization. So it won't be the same for you, but figure out, maybe it is, you know, how many trips are made on foot, right, in this nodal development, you know, but ask yourself, how would I know if this was any different than the other pattern? What would it begin to look like? And what are the first signs of it? And that will begin to tell you if you're on the right track or not, because you can make adjustments in planning. You know, you can do things to say, all right, you can do it this way for this phase, and then we'll evaluate for the second phase, or whatever it might be. But in a lot of ways, you know, you have data and you have the ability to collect data that a lot of people don't pay any attention to. So ask yourself that question when you want to try something new. What's the first sign that it might be working or not working?
Cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Harriet, you mentioned, you know, our polycentric orientation in this region. Do you think that is an advantage or a disadvantage for a region like ours?
So, Duke, you know me well enough now to not ask me that question, because every place has advantages and disadvantages. You embrace the advantage part. So I live in a polycentric region, and what I see as a clear advantage is that when one jurisdiction does something, you know, that's innovative, like we adopted a green building code that was the greenest in the country, right? 5 years later, like, you know, 3 other jurisdictions in our region had adopted it, right? Ditto for, you know, for lots of things. Our first bike share system was just in DC, and it wasn't successful, but it got people to take a look at it. And the second one was regional. And with new jurisdictions coming in all the time, I think we're up to 9 jurisdictions now. So I think the huge advantage is that you don't have to move as lockstep. You know, different jurisdictions will want to lead on different things, on tree canopy, on stormwater, on housing affordability, on transportation choices. So let them lead. And then, you know, let the other jurisdictions kick the tires of this innovation and race to catch up. You know, because let's be honest, I'm sure you all feel like you're in a friendly competition with each other at some level. So use it. But let's please race to the top and not to the bottom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a sense that maybe where you would go with that question. So that's why I phrased it that way. Looks like Luke has a question. Luke, go ahead and unmute.
Hey there.
Good to see you.
I just wanted to ask about your experiences with maybe like de-siloing some of the places that you work with. I think a lot of places in this region have these silos within the cities themselves, and it just does not help decision making as far as being you know, kind of on the same page as things. Could you speak to a little bit of, you know, maybe some methods or things that you've seen work over your career to stop
I have
those
so
silos?
many. examples of that, because you're right, it's a big problem, especially if you're the, if you're the planning director or the planning professional who thinks you're really responsible for everything. So we had a kind of a lot of turnover, relatively speaking, among some of our agency heads. I mean, it wasn't ridiculous, but I was relatively long-lived as planning director, so I worked for 2 different mayors. So, I really thought transportation and planning needed to be in lockstep and talking together a lot, along with economic development. So I never really was successful with economic development, but with transportation, I was. And by the second director, and there were 4 during my tenure over almost 8 years, I was able to say to the second one, oh, this is how we do it. We meet every 2 weeks. We trade off in offices. We do joint things together. Here's an example, because I was able to get some of that done with the first transportation director. But after that, I was the old hand. They were the newbie, and they more or less, said, oh, we must coordinate. How weird, but all right, that's just how they do it here. So in other cases, I could get the mayor to do things. Like when I was asked to do a sustainability plan, I said, this has to be done across agencies. So I need 2 things. I need to do this primarily with the environmental agency, but I need a sustainability cabinet. It doesn't have to be permanent, but for the plan, so that every agency has a component that they are implementing. So I also want you, Mayor, to put a small fund aside that we compete for by collaborating. So no one agency can get the money, but 2 or more agencies can get the money for a project they're doing together. Because that's the other problem. Like, we waste a lot of money because we mobilize for a project in a neighborhood, and it turns out schools was doing a project, public works was doing a project, transportation was doing a project, parks was doing a project, and they were all mobilizing and demobilizing on separate schedules, and some of their objectives overlapped completely. So by having some of those conversations and getting people to work with each other more, we were able to be much more collaborative around some of those things. So those are a couple of suggestions, but it often starts with willing individuals. So you might have a colleague not at the top of the agency, but somewhere else, who's willing to work together. And again, you make it safe for your higher ups that you do this thing together, and you give them a lot of credit and praise, including some public opportunities for them to sit down together and talk about this project of yours that these 2 agencies are doing together. You get them invited to conferences out of town where they talk about it. You make them the hero, and it makes it safe for you to do that stuff.
That's really great. Thank you so much. Given that you're in DC and I think much closer to some of the federal programs that some of our municipalities could take advantage of, what are some of those kind of low-hanging fruit type programs or initiatives that you think municipalities need to be thinking about and implementing? Maybe as they're looking forward and thinking of climate resiliency, thinking of climate change, what are some of the federal areas of focus that we should think about locally?
So this is a really good question. And I think a region of your size, cities of your size, are really well poised, meaning the feds want to get money to you, right? That's what they've said. They've also said they would really love it if you were partnering with community-based organizations in your jurisdictions. And whatever the program at HUD, at EPA, at DOT, at Commerce, at Agriculture, if you are working with community-based organizations, including communities that have been overlooked or harmed by past efforts, so these are communities of color, low-income communities, if you have organizations like yours that can help provide capacity, if you can get philanthropic funding, it almost doesn't matter what grants. What you are trying to create is a durable, set of partnerships that can over and over again compete for grants. Every agency has a dozen grants that you could compete for to meet the objectives that we've talked about today, right? It's not any one program, there's tons of them. But what places lack is the engagement with community-based organizations, a set of objectives and goals that they're trying to reach that are multifaceted, so that you can honestly say to a community, like, look, we are going to go after this project. It only meets this one objective, right? It's not doing the other things that you're asking for, but bear with us. This is just the first of many. And next, we're going to target HUD that's going to be dealing with housing issues that you're concerned about, or we're going to get philanthropic support, to do a demonstration. But it's the durable partnership, the agreed upon values, the shared values, and the objectives that you have in common. There are, in every region, there are places that are putting money into those same objectives that you're not working with. So this helps you put those objectives out front and find out who's aligned with you, who's already putting money into something like this, so that you can work together. And that durable partnership is the thing. That's the thing that's going to really make your region thrive and make all the outcomes better. I feel terrible for these places that chase a single grant, maybe year after year. Like, anything in the context of our conversation today, there are dozens and dozens of federal grants that could be used to fund that activity. So it doesn't really matter so much what you go after. It matters that you started well, that you have the broad coalition, you have the shared values, you have the aligned ambitions, the broad aligned ambitions. Now go to town, go after lots of different grants. But yeah.
Form those partnerships, and you mentioned durability several times that can last. Given the philanthropic interest in our region, what role can philanthropy play as we're thinking of our housing challenges, thinking of our transportation challenges, our growth challenges? I'd love your thoughts on philanthropy.
So I think philanthropy is really important. I mean, I have rarely done an initiative anywhere in my career that didn't have some support from philanthropy. When I was a Fed, I couldn't raise money directly, but I called myself a funder. I couldn't ask for money from philanthropy, but I could write to philanthropy and say, as a funder, this is what I am funding. This is why I'm funding it. They might come to you for funding, and you'll be informed by what I'm doing. So it was a way for me to endorse without endorsing. It was a way for me to ask for money without asking, right? So philanthropy is very important, but not just for the money, right? Philanthropy is important as a convener, as a legitimizer, as a partner that can bring in other partners. Even if philanthropy gave you not $1, but opened some doors, right, to other possible partners, that would be huge. So I think that it's really important. And when philanthropy can fund, it can provide, especially regional foundations, local foundations, they can provide support that can be multi-year. Because I talked about the first thing that planners should be thinking about. What's the first indication that the thing that you're trying is working or not working? For lots of people, the first thing isn't enough. Like what constitutes success might be property value changes, or, in my case, population growth. That doesn't happen overnight, or other things. And you need a partner that can help support community-based organizations and help support your initiative, maybe for years, until the results of it are undisputed, right? And now maybe more funding can be attracted, and maybe more folks are interested in supporting these other organizations. But that's a super important thing for philanthropy, and that government funding is really limited in what it can do. It often can't pay for the time of residents to participate. It can't pay sometimes for the services that residents need in order to participate. It can't pay for travel sometimes. So yeah, philanthropic funding and philanthropic support critical.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'd like to make one kind of last call for questions. If you have one that's on the tip of your tongue, please jump in, raise your hand. I'll just kind of summarize with this. I mean, what I think I've taken from this is the get out there, lead, try something, but do it right the first time. We mentioned before the call started, Harriet and I were chatting, and you mentioned, including the bike lane, including the infrastructure while you're building the road the first time. And try something. It might just be temporary. You might need to tweak it, but go ahead and get out there and try it. What are some other just takeaways that you'd like us to take from this? And what am I missing from my kind of summary of takeaways?
I would just say that you are, that you're lucky. You're in a growing region. You have organizations that are supporting your work. You have the ability to foment some friendly competition among your jurisdictions. You have civically engaged corporations, who could be partners for some of the things that you're doing. And there are ways for you to take chances and to try new things and to be creative without having, undue amounts of risk. You should be looking for your ghost of Christmas future out there, because you need some negative comparisons, but also who might be a model for you for positive things as well. And remember, you have the greatest job in the world. You get to think about the future. How cool is that? And that you get to tell people about the future that's coming, good, bad, and ugly. And help your communities get prepared for it. And what better thing is there to be able to do and spend your time on? So I'm happy to have met all of you, and I'm envious of where you are in your careers and where you are in your geography, and expect very great things from you all.
That's great. Any let's see, it looks like we may have one other question, not to drag us back into the discussion, but one around strategies, issues citizens should focus on to activate positive movements.
I mean, you always want to find allies, right? You always want to find folks who want to do things. And in some cases, the impetus for an action might come from a group of citizens who want to try something, who want to support something. You're obliged to think about the consequences and how others might feel about it. But, there might be ways that you can help support what a community, a facet of a community wants to do without having negative impacts on everyone else. And that might include doing something temporary. It might include thinking about broadening the initiative where there might be broader support. I find a lot of people call themselves environmentalists who nevertheless oppose any kind of new development. So maybe you start with an environmental initiative that gets people to the table and less something that's really focused on growth. But I think you're building coalitions all the time. Nothing you do is ever going to happen without allies. You don't get to build anything. Other people have to do it. So you have to bring them along. They have to want to do it, and they have to give your plans momentum. Right? Yeah. The plan that sits on the shelf a couple of years where nothing happens, it might as well have never been done. You need to snatch that momentum at the very beginning. You need to create it at the very beginning, and you need allies that will support it. So, that means involving people in the process and trying to develop the plan that speaks to what they also want to try to achieve. So you get that alignment. So But yeah, there's no one place to start. There's a million places to start in every community, and you know, you just have to pick and choose. And maybe for you, it'll be a little trial and error while you learn kind of what works. But you know, there's nothing wrong with you haven't failed until you've stopped trying, right? So mistakes are part of the process. And again, you can inoculate yourself against risk by saying, we're trying something. We expect to have some degree of failure. We're going to try these 3 things. We think maybe only one of them will work, but we think that places that are preparing for the future and preparing their residents for the future can't just do things the way we've always done them.
Yeah. Such an important point to emphasize as we wrap up. Well, I thank you, Harriet, so much. This was just terrific. You know, our first Zoom and virtual engagement session, I think it went quite well. So
hold up,
look for more of these. Okay.
One thing,
sure.
One more thing. I have a question for all of you. You are in a vastly growing region. There are lots of places that are starting to get all around the country new manufacturing, and a lot of it is going into small communities, rural communities in some cases, sometimes bringing 10,000 jobs. So I want you to imagine you were talking to your predecessor 30 years ago, right? I want to know what's your advice that you would give that predecessor. What should they do to prepare your community for the issues that you are now grappling with, that you have to face? And you can send them via email. Maybe we leave the chat open for a little longer, but you guys had such great questions. I know you'll have thoughts about this. And I'd like to share it with some of the folks that are beginning to experience these growth pressures that could be like Northwest Arkansas in 30 years. So I'd love to get your insights and maybe even call on some of you to have some more conversation with some of these people, some of these communities that are facing some of these issues. Can I get people to give me any indication that that they will help to do this? Like send something to Duke and Isabel so that we can continue this conversation and maybe take your experience and be able to use it in some other places. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to think about. I mean, we are looking forward, we're looking for best practices, but other communities are looking at us and looking for best practices from us. So
including like what could have been done better. I have so many things I wish I had done differently in every job I've had. So yeah, we all have that, but let's let other people learn from it. It's to do something, you know, to say that, oh, I didn't do it in the very best way is not the end of the world. We have to be able to make mistakes and learn from them.
That's great. Well,
thanks, guys.
We can leave the chat open for a little bit. I think most of you can know where to find myself, know where to find Isabel. It's Duke at nwacouncil.org, Isabel at nwacouncil.org as well. I also want to put a plug in for our next speaker series on August 30th. It's going to be at the Jones Center over the lunch hour. Where the topic is going to be alternative financing options for affordable housing. As interest rates are historically high or relatively in the recent history, they're high. Deals are not getting done. And we're going to bring some experts together to talk about alternatives to traditional financing. You can find more about that at groundworknwa.org. And thank you. This was great, Harriet. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you. It was very fun. Thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Have a great Tuesday. Thank you.